All right. So I guess the first question I'd like to ask is, would you make any changes to Kansas state taxes, and what would those specific changes be and why?
Yes, I would. First of all, what's really most important on the bigger picture is we've got to balance our budget. I know that taxes and spending are important issues, but the really bigger question is, in Kansas, we basically have eaten all our seed corn. Um, we have lived month to month, paycheck to paycheck, and actually, worse than that, we're living on credit card debt. For example, what we're um, what we're doing for our highways to bond money, interest only, for 20 years, interest only payments for 20 years. Since 2010, actually, with the Brownback Collier administration, we've bonded over $1.3 billion. So we need to put some money back in the bank and invest. That's the only way we're going to grow. Tax policy in general, I do not like sales tax on food. It is the most burdensome tax for those, particularly who struggle with income. I think if there's any tax adjustment that's necessary, it would be at the level of internet sales tax to help support brick and mortar people along main streets across the state to make that fair and equitable. Property tax we want to hold down. I do not want any increases in property tax at the state level. I could go on, but does that help answer some?
All right. While high school graduation rates have risen above of 80% in recent years, college readiness rates remain much lower. Fewer than half of graduating seniors leave high school on track to earn even a C in college courses, and about 40% of those who enroll in college are placed in remedial courses. This means a huge percentage of high school diplomas handed out every year are empty promises. What will you do to close this college and career readiness gap in the state? And what will you do to ensure parents get more honest information about their children's readiness for success after high school?
Those are great questions, and it's unacceptable where we are right now. Clearly unacceptable, and we actually were just looking at that data last evening. So that's broken down in many different ways as to why some children don't succeed. It's especially high in poverty. So socioeconomics play a huge role here. Those children need extra help to bring themselves up. And so one of our focuses in the campaign goes back to very early childhood preparation and learning. If children aren't caught up to speed by the time they get into kindergarten, if they're not ready for kindergarten, they're likely going to fail. So if we're going to address this long term, it goes back to very early childhood learning experiences. So many children now grow up in homes where they're not fed, they're neglected, they're not read to. They come to school, they don't know the color blue, and then of course it becomes a teacher's fault they don't learn. So that's where that has to be addressed, and it's going to take time to do that. But we'd save so much money. To your point, we'd save so much money if we invested there, pay a little bit more there, a whole lot less later.
We need kind of a program where the parents and the teachers work together.
That collaboration is always good, absolutely.
What do you think will be the biggest obstacle in accomplishing your goals as governor, and how do you plan to address that obstacle?
I think the biggest obstacle is really economic growth. That is the greatest challenge for the next governor. If we can't get the state's economy growing, we're all sunk. We're not going to have enough money for roads or schools or health care. So the keys to economic development then would be the answer to your question. Number one, we ask businesses what they need to succeed over and over again. Workforce training, infrastructure, healthcare, education, quality of life issues. Those are the main keys that businesses are looking for to succeed. In the last 7 years with Brownback and Collier, with the tax experiment, we put our eggs in one basket, zeroing out taxes for a certain few and we let all the rest go. So the first thing is to restore those basic elements, which will take time to do. Second thing is this, our state's very different regionally. So this part of the state is much different than Johnson County, much different than southeast Kansas, much different than southwest Kansas on, much different than central. So we need a governor that recognizes that our state is different regionally. Now we haven't approached economic development in that way since Bill Graves was governor. Respecting local control, 95% of economic development is local. Example where that goes wrong is Tonganoxie. The chicken plant brought in behind closed doors, people erupted, project failed. Third key is we're more than just ag, oil, and aviation. We need to look at all the regions and look at their assets. And the last issue is this, we need a new relationship between business and education so that business can go to education and say, here's the workforce we need. Education should be going to business and asking, what do you need for a trained workforce so we can grow your economy? Those would be the challenges and how we address it.
Okay. All right. Should Kansas raise the minimum wage, and what is a fair wage?
Well, great question. You know, I want everybody to have a wage that can support them and their minimum needs for living. The living wage in Kansas is a great question. It varies a little bit, but it's probably in the range of $14 to $15 an hour, and it depends upon if it's you or if you have a family to support. But that's probably a pretty good answer to that. Now, Kansas is a unique state in many ways, so I don't see a minimum wage coming about to that in this state. So the real answer is getting better paying jobs to Kansas, which goes back to economic growth like we talked about.
All right. And how would you address education funding?
That's the most challenging funding question I think we have short term here. I've read the 88 pages of Gannon, the court case. I've reviewed the history when in 2014 the legislature wrote into law what are called Rhodes capacities and called them standards. They're not standards at all. They come from the 1980s in Kentucky. They're like, you know your emotional well-being, you should know your physical health. You can't measure those, but the legislature put those into law. The governor signed it and asked the State Board of Education to develop a plan to reach it. They did. They said it was $893 million. So last year the the state put in $293 million. You subtract that off, 893 at $600 million. So I think that's a ballpark figure what it takes to get out of court. And you know, if you don't like the court decision, you don't thumb your nose at it. If you get a speeding ticket, you probably generally pay that speeding ticket too. So we need to get out of court, but we've got to stay out of court because we're sending a message to young people we don't value teachers and we don't value education. We talk to teacher after teacher who tell their own children, don't go into education. The economics don't make sense and the state has lost respect for education. So it's not only funding, but it's also changing the narrative that we value teachers and we value education. That is an important narrative for the governor and lieutenant governor to change.
All right. If you do not win the Republican nomination, what are your plans in terms of ensuring the Democratic candidate does not win the election?
No, that's a great question. And ultimately that's up to the voters, you know. So I think through the process of this campaign, the best thing we can do is talk about ideas and to contrast ourselves to other candidates so that voters can be better informed. And frankly, that's why we're here today and why we so appreciate you giving us this time. And this is such a sweet setting to get the interview.
And in addition to, and we got to the Libertarian candidates that we have, we also have Greg Orman as an independent. What do you think he will do to the mix?
Well, my crystal ball broke, okay? I tell my patients that a long time ago, my crystal ball broke. But I sort of see Greg Orman and the Democratic nominee washing each other out to some extent. Again, my crystal ball broke, but I think that makes it even more likely that the Republican nominee will be the state's next governor.
If you do not win the Republican nomination, what are your plans in terms of ensuring the Democratic candidate does not win the election?
No, that's a great question. And ultimately, that's up to the voters, So I think through the process of this campaign, the best thing we can do is talk about ideas and to contrast ourselves to other candidates so that voters can be better informed. And frankly, that's why we're here today and why we so appreciate you giving us this time. And this is such a sweet setting to get the interview.
And in addition to, and we got to the Libertarian candidates that we have, we also have Greg Orman as an independent. What do you think he will do to the mix?
Well, my crystal ball broke, okay? I tell my patients that a long time ago, my crystal ball broke. But I sort of see Greg Orman and the Democratic nominee washing each other out to some extent. Again, my crystal ball broke, but I think that makes it even more likely that the Republican nominee will be the state's next governor.
All right. Question number 7. Do you believe marijuana should be legalized in some form? If so, what conditions would you include? To date, 7 states have passed laws legalizing recreational marijuana, and in the state of Colorado, $135 million in taxes and fees flowed into the state budget in just 1 year. On the surface, these changes make financial sense and would decriminalize common teenager behavior. Do you support the legalization of marijuana for recreation or just for medical use?
That is a well-written question. And we hear this issue a lot on the campaign trail early on. So, first of all, I'm going to talk just a little bit about hemp. I really support agricultural hemp, and it's probably our state's way of stepping into this answer, which is a challenging answer. And agricultural hemp, brings new agricultural products, uses less water, and there's economic opportunity there. Going back to your tax question. Next question is medicinal marijuana. And I will look at any bill that comes across my desk on an evidence-based approach, but I think that is probably the closest thing that this state is ready to start looking at. Now, the real question is the legalization fully or for recreational use, and I think the answers are still out there because I talk with a lot of people, a lot of different walks of life that raise positives and negatives, and tax revenue, yes, but negatives on the downside, social issues and homelessness, etc., and traffic safety issues too, with our fatality rates being up in Kansas, and the thought is some of that's coming from Colorado. So I think the evidence is still out on that, and I would like to look at that before I would answer that. And again, I would come back to that position that I'll look at any bill that comes to my desk on an evidence basis. Yeah.
What place do guns have in the state's 8 schools? Do you support arming teachers and school staff? Should parents and visitors with concealed carry permits be allowed to bring their guns into school or onto school grounds and into classrooms?
First of all, I support the Second Amendment and the right for self-protection. I don't support arming teachers as a solution, and I think that the laws are such where guns may or may not be permitted, that we probably don't need to open that book or that chapter again right now when we have so many other problems that need our attention, like balancing our budget. The laws are such now that teachers can carry their weapons concealed in schools right now. I would think that in those settings you want those individuals to be trained, know how to properly use such a weapon. In general, I don't support giving cash bonuses to teachers. This has been proposed by both Secretary Kobach and Governor Collier as well. I don't support those measures. And I think the real challenge for the next governor for school safety comes to restoring and rebuilding a functioning mental health system. We've seen during the Brownback-Collier years systematic dismantling of mental health care, and now it's in our schools, our jails, our emergency rooms, it's on our streets, and it's in our homeless shelters. And that's really not what Kansas is about. Those are not the values that Kansas represents to Rosie and me.
All right. Why should the people of Kansas vote for you?
We've got to pivot as a state. Kansas has come down in the last 7 years. It's not the state we used to know it. The amount of poverty around Kansas is astounding and frankly disheartening. We have generational failure now of families, generational poverty, behavioral health issues, and substance abuse. We have, again, seen living month to month, paycheck to paycheck, institutionalizing Kansas during the Brownback-Collier tax experiment and failure. If we don't invest in this state, our highways, our hospitals, our mental health facilities, to take care of those in need, we're never going to know Kansas like we used to know it. We're the only Republican candidate, governor and lieutenant governor, who are saying that and willing to make those hard decisions. That's why Kansas will be better off with a Barnett Hansen ticket. And by the way, thanks for letting me bring and introduce my wife and running mate for Lieutenant Governor, Rosie Hansen.
Our pleasure. All right. It is 2030, and you have served 2 terms as governor. What are people saying about your legacy? What are your biggest concrete accomplishments?
That's fun. Question. I love it. Well, first of all, I believe in term limits. I know the governor's office is term limited, and it should be, but I believe in term limits in general. I've supported those all along, and I've self-imposed them on the school board and in the Kansas Senate as well. 2 things. Number one, turn the state's economy around. We have the potential to do so much better in so many ways. Economic growth and not being a flyover state and a state where people want to come and live and raise their family. Number one is turning the state's economy around, and we can do that. Number 2 is to crack the nut about generational poverty and generational failure to family. We can do that too by investing in early childhood learning, making that a robust program. It's a public-private partnership with schools and communities where they want it and need it, and it's needed across the state. But that's what gives me tingles to just break this generational failure of the family that has swept across Kansas.
Right. That's all the questions I have written. Do you have any additional questions?
No, you covered the 2 biggest questions that I had.
All right.
Thank you so much. This is
Thank
really
you.
fun.
Yeah.
I wish I would have asked